Okay. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the next Learn session for the online assembly today, Crisis Anticipation and Risk Financing, Enhancing Global Initiatives for Early and Anticipatory Action. To introduce myself, my name is Ella Gerry. I'm the Technical Analysis Advisor in the Crisis Anticipation and Risk Financing team at Start Network. And I'm joined by Anna Farina, who is the Head of Crisis Anticipation and Risk Financing, and Taylor Hernandez, who is our Policy and Advocacy Advisor. Just some housekeeping before we start. Please make sure that you have joined the correct interpretation channel if you need it. So by clicking on the globe at the bottom of the screen and choosing between English, French, Spanish. And please also note that there is time at the end of this session for any questions and answers. So if you have any throughout or any thoughts you want to share, please pop them in the Q&A chatbot function so we can pick them up. Okay, so just an introduction. As we have already heard from the introduction session today, at Start Network, we aim to shift the way in which humanitarian action is done. So through how it is approached, resourced, and delivered. And one of the ways that we are shifting the sector is through our crisis anticipation and risk financing work, where our goal is to help build a global financing system that better anticipates and acts ahead of predictable crises to reduce risks. Okay, so an overview of this session then. So this session is a Learn session that we are taking the opportunity to take a look at Start Network's crisis anticipation and risk financing work through the lens of different global disaster risk financing and risk reduction initiatives. So these are the Sendai Framework, Early Warnings for All, Loss and Damage, and Global Shield. So as this is a Learn session, we will be giving an overview of each and discussing how Start Network currently aligns to such initiatives. So this is really an opportunity to place the work of Start Network within bigger global pictures on efforts on disaster risk reduction and financing and climate action and financing. So we will be discussing how we think that this alignment can be strengthened moving forwards. But in the Q&A at the end, we are also keen to hear from you on your thoughts about these global initiatives, where you see the place of Start Network, what you think the strengths of Start Network can bring to meeting the targets of these initiatives. So before we jump straight in, we're just going to take a look at some terms and definitions of these terms that we will be looking at a lot throughout the session. For some of you, these may be fairly new terms, for some not so new, and for others just a good refresher. So what do we mean by anticipatory action, early action? This is acting to prior to or earlier in the evolution of a crisis to prevent or reduce humanitarian impacts before they fully unfold. And disaster risk financing is really a way of protecting people in advance of disasters. It involves the three key pillars that are shown on the slide here. So analyzing risks and setting triggers, pre-agreed plans, and pre-positioned financing. So why do we believe in the importance of anticipation and early action and disaster risk financing in the humanitarian sector? As we have heard earlier, the result of the climate crisis, rising inequalities, political instabilities, increasing population densities, and so on, we know that risks and disasters are becoming increasingly complex and more frequent. We also know or have typically observed that the humanitarian sector as a whole has often had a slowness to act, taking a reactive approach to disaster risk. And consequently, funds and crucial support have not always reached those that need it most at the right time. So through our crisis anticipation and risk financing work, we really want to push this shift in the humanitarian system's approach to disaster risk from being reactive to proactive. Okay, so how does Start Network currently support members in this arena of anticipation, early action, and disaster risk financing? On the screen are some broad overviews of the the work we do, the support we offer, what the network does to shift from being reactive to disaster risk to proactive. So that's supporting members to access and use risk information, bridging the gap between scientific expertise and humanitarian practice, building an evidence base for anticipatory action and disaster risk financing, advocating for civil society within these spaces, and developing crisis financing mechanisms to enable members to deliver these anticipatory early actions and build these disaster risk financing systems. So just to mention, there is Start Fund and Start Ready, which we've already heard a bit about, but brief overview. Start Fund is our crisis financing tool, which is a rapid gap filling mechanism where members can access it in the early stages of a crisis for early action or in anticipation of an upcoming crisis for anticipatory action. And then Start Ready is one of our newer crisis financing mechanisms, which pre-positions funding for predictable crises like floods, droughts, cyclones, and it follows the 3 pillars mentioned on the last slide. So analyzing risks and setting triggers, pre-agreed plans, and pre-positioned funds. There is a whole session later on what happened in Start Ready's first year, so do tune into that if you're interested in hearing more. Okay, so taking a look at the first initiative we're going to cover, now that we have looked at some definitions and the work that Start Network currently does on early action, anticipatory action, we'll be looking at the Sendai Framework, which is the United Nations Office for Disaster Risk Reduction's framework for disaster risk reduction that's spanning 2015 to 2030. So we are over halfway through now, and this is a framework that has been laid out the pathway for disaster risk reduction, global disaster risk reduction until 2030. And it was set up in 2015 alongside the Sustainable Development Goals and the Paris Agreement on climate change, which is that plan to keep temperature increases below 2 degrees above pre-industrial levels to curb global warming. And the Sendai framework essentially aims to achieve a substantial reduction of disaster risk and losses of lives, livelihoods, and assets of communities. And to achieve the framework goal, it sets out 4 priority actions, which can be seen on the slide. So that's understanding disaster risk, strengthening disaster risk governance to manage disaster risk, investing in disaster risk reduction and resilience, and enhancing disaster preparedness for effective response and to build back better in recovery, rehabilitation, and reconstruction. So how do we see the alignment of Start Network's work with achieving these priority actions? So firstly, we believe that anticipatory and early action plays an effective and good role in the protection of lives and livelihoods, the protection of development and resilience gains, and the protection of people's dignity against disasters. And whilst it must be said that this Sendai framework is primarily aimed at states, national governments as having the primary role in reducing disaster risk, there's also a recognition that to achieve the priority actions and the targets of the Sendai framework, a whole of society approach is required. So the role of civil society is also crucial in achieving its targets, and particularly that of local and national NGOs. And this is because they bring invaluable knowledge, understanding, and expertise around disasters and risks. So therefore, there's alignment with the ambition to push the humanitarian system to being more proactive, and also Start Network's ambition to shift power and build a locally led humanitarian system that embeds these invaluable voices in the management of disaster risk. Okay, and then moving on to the next initiative is the Early Warnings for All. And this is focused on ensuring that everyone on the planet is protected from hazardous weather and climate events through early warning systems by the end of 2027. It's co-led by the World Meteorological Organization and the UN Office for Disaster Risk Reduction, and provides a lot of support to some of the key Sendai Framework targets, but it is also an initiative that goes beyond the UN and has partnerships with Red Cross, Red Crescent, big tech, donors, development banks, and importantly, civil society. So much like Sendai Framework, it needs this whole of society approach to achieve these global targets of better protecting people against disasters. So it's made up of four main pillars. These are disaster risk knowledge, detection, observations, monitoring and analysis and forecasting of hazards, preparedness and response capabilities, and warning dissemination and communication. So again, to think about how START network aligns, we see that anticipatory and early action is what can link these early warnings to flexible financial instruments like Start Fund, like Start Ready, to trigger actions based on these early warning systems that can mitigate impact of hazards on the most vulnerable communities. So essentially playing a crucial role in utilizing the early warning systems to deliver this action to reduce the humanitarian impacts of disasters. And if we zoom in a bit closer to each of the pillars, for disaster risk knowledge, we are working, well, firstly, disaster risk knowledge is essential for anticipatory action and early action. Understanding risks is a critical part of this. This is what the pre-agreed financing is structured around. And so therefore, Start Network works to help build these shared holistic understandings of risks that importantly incorporates the knowledge and understanding of local actors and communities. And then moving on to detection, observation, monitoring, we work on guidance and support to our members and their partners to access, interpret, and act on early warnings, so such as forecast data, risk models, and this is part of our desire to bridge the gap between science and humanitarian. So for example, in the Start Fund, there is the anticipation window, which allows members to access funding before the peak of a crisis. But this requires a level of risk analysis to assess what the impacts may be before the crisis has occurred. So we work to support in this risk analysis in order to deliver the most appropriate actions ahead of the crisis. For the third pillar, preparedness and response capabilities, as a network, we push collaborative approaches to this proactive management of disaster risk. So for example, in the DRF systems that go into Start Ready pool, they have pre-agreed plans that should be coordinated plans between INGOs, NGOs, local partners, and other relevant stakeholders in the region, and incorporate local capacities and knowledge so that members and all interested stakeholders are prepared and ready to act on early warnings. And finally, for warning dissemination and communication, we believe that through pushing this shift to locally led action, that local actors are the key to ensuring that early warnings are accessible, able to be interpreted, and reach every person at risk, where the last mile becomes the first mile in risk communication. And through our forewarn networks, both at the global level and national level, we are working to broker partnerships with Met offices, mapping services to help connect up the end users of these early warning systems, our members, with those that are feeding into their development. So I'm now going to pass over to Anna, who's going to run us through loss and damage and Global Shield.
Hi everyone, this is Anna Farina. I'm heading the Crisis Anticipation and Risk Finance team at START Network. So I will go through two initiatives that relates very much to the climate space, the loss and damage and the Global Shield. So starting from loss and damage, so first of all, what do we mean when we talk about loss and damage? let's clarify the concept of loss and damage that is different from mitigation and adaptation efforts in the climate space. So mitigation focuses on reducing greenhouse gas emission to basically prevent or slow down the progression of climate change. Adaptation involves those measures that are taken to minimize the impact of climate change on vulnerable communities and also on the ecosystems. While when we talk about loss and damage, this concept addresses basically the residual impact that are beyond the scope of mitigation and adaptation. So loss and damage in the context of climate change refers to those irreversible and unavoidable impacts and losses that result from extreme weather events, rising sea level, and other consequences of climate change. Basically, it's a concept that comes in when mitigation and adaptation efforts have been completed, but not enough to basically determine a complete resolution of this effect. Some of the development countries, so what was realized is that obviously some of the developing countries that contributed the least to climate change are those particularly vulnerable and disproportionately affected by climate-related loss and damage. So at COP27 last year in Sharm el-Sheikh, a decision was reached to establish a sort of new funding arrangement that includes a fund for responding to loss and damage. And this was considered quite a big milestone in this space. This fund should assist these countries in coping with the severe consequences that are created by climate change, which often exceed the capacity of this country to manage. So this loss and damage financing mechanism can encompass several components, some of which are like insurance and risk reduction. It could include like the development of insurance schemes and risk reduction strategy that help vulnerable communities and countries to cope with loss and damage caused by climate-related events. It can also include dedicated funds that provide support for loss and damage. It includes technical assistance and also research and data collection. So we have seen that the scale of loss and damage is obviously exacerbated by the climate crisis and will likely overwhelm the already stretched humanitarian resources that are currently available to deal with climate change. So at our network, we think that anticipatory and early action must play a very important role in addressing the residual risk that have not been averted when climate change mitigation efforts have only partially reduced the causes of climate events, or where there have been inadequate disaster risk reduction and adaptation efforts. As you know, so at STAR Network, we also work hard to shift the power dynamics and put affected population and local actors in the driving seat. And so we therefore feel that the loss and damage financing mechanism must be aligned with the calls that are received directly from countries experiencing the biggest effect of climate change, and they have to cover both economic and non-economic loss and damage, including obviously the impact on life, society, and environment. And this must be deeply driven by the effect that communities in those countries are experiencing. The other point we have on loss and damage funding is that we feel this should not be duplicative financing, but rather in addition to existing financing from other sectors like humanitarian development and climate. And furthermore, the loss and damage financing mechanism should ensure that funding reach people at community affected and at risk of climate impact, as I said. So This initiative, as I said, was launched at COP27, and updated are expected at COP28, especially in terms of how this mechanism will be operationalized in the near future. Next slide, please. So I'm now going to explain you the Global Shield, which is another mechanism that is defined as the Global Shield against climate risk, and was as well launched at COP27, building on a joint effort by the G7 and the Vulnerable 20 group, the V20, and contribute to international effort to avert, minimize, and address climate-related loss and damage through better prearranged finance, resulting in better financial protection. So as you can see, the Global Shield and the concept of loss and damage are very linked together, and Global Shield has been seen as a component into the loss and damage financing mechanism. So the Global Shield is very much focused on the prearranged finance, which is also an area where START Network is very strong through our financing mechanism like START Fund and START Ready. So the role of the Global Shield is basically to provide a concrete offer for countries to scale the financial protection of their most vulnerable population groups, and therefore to contribute to address, as I said, loss and damage. It's like a platform that serves for prearranged finance and helps countries to easily access this support by identifying the gaps and the needs through those country-led processes that are involving governments and local actors at country level. So to ensure a systematic and coherent approach, the Global Shield financing structure is formed by 3 different financial channels. So there are 3 financial mechanisms within the Global Shield to disburse funds, and they are addressed and to different actors. So the 3 financial mechanisms are called the Global Shield Solution Platform, or the GSSP, that is basically providing packages needed to address country-specific challenges, and it serves as a primary Global Shield financing vehicle to leverage private sector and cooperate with complementary CDRFI initiatives and programs. The second mechanism is the Global Shield Financing Facility, which is basically the reshape and the reform of the Global Risk Financing Facility, the GRIF, that is hosted by the World Bank, and is directed especially to development banks and UN agencies. And the third mechanism is the CVF MV20 Joint Multi-Donor Fund. That's is basically a vehicle for projects designed by the V20, included communities, enterprise, and ecosystem solutions. So because the way that the mechanism is structured, the Global Shield also wants to facilitate complementary work across implementing organizations like multilateral development bank, private sector, development organization, and civil society. So there's a lot of facilitation of interaction between all these different actors, and the plan to access funding from the Global Shield are coming by consortium of government, multilateral development banks, private sector institution, and civil society. So as for the loss and damage mechanism, also the plan for the global shield is to continue working on facilitating the collaboration between these different institutions. And the first results are expected to be showcased at COP28. We know that in terms of like in-country mechanism, the first country where this is already happening is Ghana, and there have been selected the first cohort of countries, which is made of 8 different countries. So we expect at COP28 to receive more announcement, not only on the amount of funds available, but also on the way that these funds will be disbursed through the 3 different financing mechanisms that I explained before. And I now pass the floor to Tyler for the next few slides. Thank you.
Thanks, Anna. So how does START Network align with these specific global initiatives? Obviously, it's important to understand what's going on within this space to see how they're pushing forward different messages or asks that are related to our work, but we also want to understand how START Network specifically aligns with these global initiatives. And we've identified 3 specific areas here, kind of tying in all 4 of these global initiatives that Ella and Anna have already presented. So the first one is on the understanding of disaster risk. So these initiatives promote holistic understandings of disaster risk, and we need to have the skill to forecast hazards, understand vulnerabilities and exposures to these hazards, coping capacities to best inform early action, and more. Through initiatives by START Network, such as our More network, partnerships, and technical expertise, we aim to bridge this gap between the scientific expertise in the more technical side with the humanitarian expertise that we have as a network. We also want to ensure that local knowledge is embedded in informing the understandings of disaster risk. The second area that we have is around the proactive management of risks. So through our financing mechanisms, we pool funding, allowing for a more rapid release of funds to further anticipatory and early action. Additionally, through our modeling of climate risks in specific countries, we have set triggers and pre-agreed plans for when a trigger is met, allowing for more advanced planning and a more proactive approach to manage risks. And then finally, a more coordinated and inclusive approach. Our financing mechanisms are available to our members, which include local, national, and international NGOs all over the world. This allows for a diversity of actors to access funding, and particularly due to our commitment for a more locally led action, local actors to access risk information and funding. Next slide, please, Ellen. So in terms of what's next, in order to align with the ambitions of the global initiatives that we've presented, as well as to push for more to be done, START Network continues to advocate for anticipatory and early action. The following are our key messages around this, which we highlight key advocacy opportunities such as events and policy discussions through our campaigns and in external media. The first one is around scaling up pre-arranged financing and ensuring that this can be done in a flexible and anticipatory manner. So this includes financing towards local actors, as well as considering our own financing mechanisms, such as Start Ready that I mentioned, as well as Start Fund. We are trying to encourage a more innovative and flexible approach to anticipatory and early action, and specifically in the Start Fund case, even for hazards where forecasting and risk analysis may not be so clear-cut or requires unique approaches, we're still able to act in anticipation. So really ensuring that there's financing that meets these ambitions and goals of these mechanisms. The second is for more locally led anticipatory action. So by engaging with local actors at every stage, from decision-making to planning to implementation, in order to better support these, local actors and affected communities need to have a collective understanding of risks and have information be developed with these end users in mind. So really supporting this involvement of local actors and a more locally led approach for the collective understanding of risk, coordinated and localized alert systems, and quality forecast information that's developed with the end users. Thirdly, in order to make the case for anticipatory and early action, we need a robust evidence base to demonstrate its effectiveness and importance. So continuing to advocate for an improved evidence base around this and collective best practices shared with partners and stakeholders. And then finally, we need to recognize and understand that anticipatory approaches are not a silver bullet and cannot work in all instances. So it is important that they are still complemented and connected to wider disaster risk management efforts and resilience building. So advocating for that as well.
Okay, thanks, Anna and Taylor. We now have, I think, roughly 15 minutes for a bit of a Q&A, and we already have some questions coming in. The first one I can see is to Anna. It says, Anna, it would be great to know, has there been any common methodology to calculate loss and damage, as currently we have PDNA, which is primarily led by World Bank after disasters?
I see the question.
Do you want me to repeat it? Is it in the chat?
Cannot see it.
It's from Mihir.
No, I don't think there is any at the moment. I think it could be one of the team that will be picked up at COP28. But there is not like from my knowledge, that is not like at the moment a current methodology that can be applicable to different risks in different countries, which would obviously be helpful to have. But I think this is also part of the operationalization of the mechanism going forward.
Great, thanks, Anna. And now we have a question which says, some of these frameworks, for example, the Sendai Framework, seem focused on disaster risk reduction and preparedness, which I don't know is a focus area for START Network, except perhaps for the preparedness funding available within START Ready. Isn't START Network more focused on crisis anticipation and response rather than disaster risk reduction? I don't know if Anna or Taylor, if you want to take this, or I'm happy to.
I really struggle to see this question. I don't see the question. I'll apologize.
It's okay, I'll read it again and then I can give a bit of an answer as well. So some of the frameworks seemed more focused on disaster risk reduction and preparedness. I'm not really sure if this is a focus area for START Network, except perhaps for the preparedness funding that is available within START Ready. Isn't START more focused on crisis anticipation and response rather than disaster risk reduction?
Okay, so I saw it now. If you want, I can start.
Yeah, sure.
So START Network, it is more focused at the moment on the anticipatory action rather than disaster risk reduction. But what we have always envisaged when we set up START Ready as a mechanism is to consider this fund going forward as a link between what can be done in disaster risk reduction and in anticipatory work. At the moment, START Ready has only a window that in preparedness that is addressed through what we call the national reserves. But there are considerations we are having internally to how could we make this more effective and how could we work with local communities and local organizations to run programs that could actually build resilience of the population throughout the year, so that once the risk season approach, people are already better prepared to deal with that. It's not an area where we are already intervening directly, also because we feel that the amount of funds available is not sufficient to look into this space, but is a consideration that we are thinking of, because we definitely feel that anticipatory action can be considered a bit of the link between development and humanitarian, and for disaster risk reduction, we will at some point fit nicely into the work that we are doing. And I think there was a session last year at the Assembly in 2022, where this was also explored with members. And there was quite a good consensus in terms of, yes, go ahead and explore it, because anticipatory action could really be seen as the missing, as the link between these two concepts.
Great, thanks, Anna. Yeah, just to second that, I guess it's about seeing it as a continuum of work that is done from disaster risk reduction, preparedness, all the way up until the anticipatory action that should happen just before the peak of a crisis. And all this work should be complementary to one another and join up well so that people are protected against risks. And yeah, it's definitely a recognition that we do mostly focus on crisis anticipation and not so much on DRR, but as Anna said, we understand that DRR is sustainable, and yeah, figuring out how we can incorporate this more, but also still recognizing that there's a lot of work to be done and there are still many risks that aren't well covered and communities that aren't well protected against. So we see the kind of flexible financing tools for anticipatory action is a good way to meet these current gaps. And move on to the next question. So what do you see the role of partner organizations and their advocacy arms in contributing to these objectives? Is it about increasing financing to these mechanisms or advocating for example, child-sensitive early actions? I'll pass that one to you, Taylor.
Yeah, thanks, Ella. And thank you for this question. I think it's good to consider specifically how we are contributing to these discussions. And I think in response, the 4 global initiatives that we presented do all have separate aims and specific audiences that engage with them. So I do think the advocacy approach is slightly different for each of them. But in general, the understanding of the global initiatives allows you to see what the current space is and what the priorities are within it from different actors at the global level to be participating in these discussions. And then in that way, seeing kind of the opportunities to maybe push for more in relation to these specific ambitions or goals of each of these global initiatives, but then also understanding if there are specific gaps as part of them that maybe your organization or a partner may work on specifically that aren't currently included in the aims of these global initiatives, of the importance to continue to advocate and push for that. So I don't think it's solely about the financing angle and seeing these global initiatives as just funds to finance anticipatory and early action and wider within the disaster risk management cycle, but also understanding that these in a way demonstrate the priorities of the global community on disaster risk reduction and linked to anticipatory and early action, and therefore allow for these opportunities to advocate greater for specific aims, such as within this question you mentioned child-sensitive early actions, that if that's something that's missing from the current discussion, then pushing for it to be included at this global level as part of these initiatives.
Great. Thanks, Taylor. We have another question on loss and damage and global shield. So This person asks, they'd be interested to know how Start Network aims to position itself within the loss and damage and global shield processes. Are we aiming to obtain funding from these instruments for Start Ready and Start Fund? Or would you rather advise your members on how to access these / participate in the process?
So on the global shield, there are conversations going on with especially one of the work of the cash stream that I presented in the financing structure. At this stage, it's still difficult to understand if Start Ready could be eligible to receive funds from this mechanism. We know that there is going to be like a dedicated window launched possibly at COP28 about risk pools, and this could be an opportunity for Start Ready to look into funding for our replica program, which is insurance. But we know so the main way for this mechanism to disburse funds is where like organization can be involved are through mechanism and system that are set up at country level through with the involvement of country governments. And so therefore there is also like an incentive for Start Network members at country level to be involved in this type of conversations and be part of systems that are put together with governments, private sector actors, and also national organization and civil societies. I don't think there's gonna be an overlap in terms of what funds can be received by a mechanism like Start Ready, or what fund can be received at country level by Start Network local members. So I didn't see this as a sort of a competition. I think there will be different type of mechanism, different financial flows that can be approached by different actors. But the part that relates to risk pool and that could be used for insurance premiums is something that we are looking into for our ARC replica program.
Great, thank you. I think, unfortunately, we only have a few minutes left. So if we can take one more quick question. This is links to the previous question on how does the insurance system work for populations affected or at risk in a DRF anticipation program? So what is the role of the insurance system?
So in a disaster risk finance system, we should consider risks according to their not only a time layer, so in terms of preparedness, anticipatory action, immediate response, early response, but we could also consider risk on a vertical layers approach. So like a risk that happen very frequently but have a small impact, or risk that happen less frequently with a medium impact, and those that happen very rarely, but when they happen have a massive impact. So insurance play a role into a disaster risk finance system because it transfers the risk to a third party, so to an insurance provider. And therefore, we could look at a disaster risk finance system where contingency funds are disbursed for medium and small crises, while very big risks cannot be basically held by organization, and therefore pass through to an insurance that can pay out in case of a big event affect the population. And this is a way of basically leverage on the funds that are received. So part of the funds received are used to pay premium to basically move the risks outside the contingency fund space and to leverage that amount of premium into a bigger payout in the case of this big event happening.
Great. Thanks, Anna. Okay, unfortunately, we have to wrap up very quickly now. Thank you so much for joining our session. We understand it's a lot of big topics and lots of, still unknowns for us as well. So we're keen to keep the dialogue going. We're now going to a 15-minute break before we have the next session at 11:30 on the Ready Pakistan Hub and their journey towards independence at the end of this year. So thank you once again for joining.
Thank you.